Hello everyone and welcome back to yet another hair news video. And today we're going to be talking about Orient Bio and a new, hair loss treatment they're coming out with called OND-1 and why people in the hair biology space are maybe paying attention a bit to it. Now, OND-1 is inspired by cyclosporine and the literature behind Cyclosporine A. Now, Cyclosporine A is a calcineurin inhibitor. And what it essentially does is it suppresses the immune system, so various sort of cells like your T cells aren't as active as they should be. And you're probably freaking out, why would we use something like this, right? Well, you have the right to have that sort of concern because Cyclosporine A and the class of drugs it typically belongs to is used in organ donor recipients, right? Because when you get an organ from somebody else who's donated that organ to you, that organ, although they try to make it as biocompatible to you, that organ has foreign antigens on it, and it may trigger your immune system to freak out and target that organ as if it is an invader of some kind, as if it's not a crucial thing that you need to survive, and ultimately it can harm the organ itself and kill you in the process. So that's why a immunosuppressant drug like cyclosporine A orally, or even tacrolimus, another drug that belongs to that same sort of class of calcineurin inhibitors, is typically used in order to prevent that immune system, reaction, right? By suppressing that reaction. Also, it's used topically too in many dermatological cases. If you have a chronic overreaction, an inflammatory reaction in your skin, then you might use something like a calcineurin inhibitor to prevent that overreaction, right? So it might even be used in psoriasis, right? You have cases where tacrolimus topically is used in psoriasis. Anyway, when we look at the literature surrounding cyclosporine A, specifically when we look at Hawkshaw et al., where they reported pronounced hypertrichosis in patients receiving cyclosporine therapy, and also Lindholm et al., where they found increased hair growth after kidney transplantation in all patients studied in androgen-sensitive skin areas, and also most in androgen-insensitive areas as well. We also have other reviews that show that hypertrichosis in organ transplant recipients that take oral cyclosporine could be anywhere between like 50 to 60%. So it's decently common enough for people to question, why might that be happening? And Orient Bio is taking this, old, I guess you can say somewhat ancient literature on cyclosporine A and trying to figure out, can we get a version of this drug onto the market and into people's hair follicles such that we strip away the immunosuppressant aspects of that drug, but also have its hair growth properties retained, if not enhanced. That's what they're trying to do. Now, although the article that I'm reading from is a sort of company-facing article, it's not fully peer-reviewed whatsoever, it's not a clinical paper, it does make some decent points about the literature. And that is, there's something about cyclosporine A that may be helpful as a hair growth stimulant. And we'll touch on that literature later on in the video. But first, what makes OND-1 so interesting is not that it's a cyclosporine A molecule, but it's also the way that this company, Orient Bio, wants to deliver OND-1, this new hair growth therapy that they're working on. The company argues that many topical hair treatments struggle because the outer skin barrier makes it hard to deliver enough of the drug to the real target, that is the hair follicle, which sits deeper into the tissue. So they proposed that they need a sort of depot-styled intradermal delivery system using lactic-co-glycolic acid, also known as PLGA. And this is supposed to release the drug locally over time while limiting systemic exposure. Now, interestingly enough, at the time this article came out, I was already doing research into PLGA formulations, but just to give you the short of it, it is a biodegradable and biocompatible synthetic copolymer that's used extensively in tissue engineering and also when it comes to drug delivery. And how it works is that it breaks down by hydrolysis into lactic acid and glycolic acid, which then the body eliminates. So it makes it very ideal for a sort of controlled release mechanism of nanoparticles and drugs as well. And we also have to take into account that they want to inject this locally into people's scalps. So Orient Bio is doing something very smart here because they want to reduce the systemic impacts of cyclosporine A. Now, again, I don't know if they are actually working with cyclosporine A or some sort of an analog that they've designed chemically to be less immunosuppressive. In my opinion, I think they're just simply using cyclosporine A and they're trying to slowly release it into the tissues, thereby also slowly burdening, or I guess reducing the burden rather, of the immune system in the person that might be using it. So it might not even be, significant enough to cause a noticeable immune system impact. And they're, again, doing this through two ways, right? They're focusing mostly on intradermal injection. So most of that sort of PLGA, cyclosporine, compound, OND-1, is being put into the tissue itself, right? It's not being injected right into the bloodstream. So by doing that, you're limiting systemic exposure. And also the PLGA, component of it, right? You have these layers, that layer of a thick copolymer that slowly, as it degrades, releases PLGA into the tissue. And once again, I think I've mentioned this in other videos, you will always have some sort of systemic leakage, right? But if not much is getting into your system, then it can't go, you're not having a significant exposure to other parts of your body, right? And because it's slowly degrading over time, maybe over a week or so, let's say for the sake of this example, instead of you getting 5 milligram one-shot systemic absorption, you're getting that spread over the course of a week, slowly trickling into your system and being excreted. And there isn't a significant load in your system for it to cause any sort of problems elsewhere in your body. The article also mentions that the company already ran a first human phase 1 study on an earlier approach, but they saw limitations in the delivery, and then they redesigned this platform rather than abandoning the whole program. Now, to understand why cyclosporine sits at the center of this news article and at Orient Bio's treatment thesis, we have to see what it actually does. Like, what is it actually doing to hair to make it grow? Now, I mentioned before that it suppresses the immune system, of course, but cyclosporine is a calcineurin inhibitor, and it belongs to this specific drug class because it blocks a protein known as calcineurin. Calcineurin is a protein enzyme, and it serves as an on-off switch on the immune, muscle, and even nerve cells. In this system, calcium acts as the messenger. Under normal resting conditions, calcineurin is locked and inactive. It only wakes up when the concentration of calcium ions inside of the cell rises, usually in response to an external signal, like maybe a neurotransmitter or an immune trigger. However, calcium doesn't directly activate the calcineurin protein. Here, in this case, it's using a middleman protein called calmodulin. So first, if we're going to use the immune case, because we're talking about the immune system so much, first, there's some kind of immune trigger, right? Maybe a T cell notices that there's a foreign antigen, and this activates other cells in your body. So a signal hits that cell, causing for calcium channels to open, and the level of calcium inside the cell spikes. So from here, you'll have calcium ions binding to a protein called calmodulin. And once bound to calmodulin, calmodulin becomes active. So calmodulin in its active state now pursues calcineurin. Once this calcium-calmodulin complex finds calcineurin, right, because remember, calmodulin is also connected to calcium. Once it finds calcineurin, it binds to this enzyme, this protein enzyme, and activates the enzyme, and it activates the enzyme by binding to the inactive aspect of calcineurin called the autoinhibitory domain. So this is a physical section that usually blocks the site that would otherwise make calcineurin inactive, right? So the calcium calmodulin complex comes by and it removes that blockage from calcineurin, and now calcineurin can do what it has to do. So now that the active site is open for calcineurin grabs its target protein, and in this case, it's going to be the NFAT, or the nuclear factor of activated T cell protein. Now, typically, NFAT is what we call phosphorylized, meaning it has a phosphate group attached to it. And these phosphates act like heavy anchors that keep NFAT, stuck, right? They're not moving around. They're stuck in the fluid of the cell, the cytoplasm of the cell. Now, calcineurin, it comes in and it snips away those phosphate groups. And in this process, it is called dephosphorylation. So now NFAT is active. This active NFAT can now move around freely in the cell and also enter the nucleus of the cell. And in the nucleus of the cell, it has your DNA. And that's where it starts the process of turning on specific genes and ultimately changing the behavior of the cell itself. Now, in this case, it's going to activate genes that are involved in the immune response. So by taking a calcineurin inhibitor, you're kind of preventing for those immune genes from being turned on as frequently, depending on what dose you take the calcineurin inhibitor at. Just out of my memory, I can recall looking at many studies where cyclosporine is typically used orally in organ transplant recipients, I think at like 900 milligram upwards to like a gram, likewise with tacrolimus. So you're getting a very, very strong immunosuppressant effect. Now, I've talked about other sort of inhibitors on the channel, like JAK inhibitors and PDE4 inhibitors, but calcineurin inhibitors find themselves to be in the middle if we're just looking at purely I guess you can say their mechanism of action, because you can't just say one is stronger than the other, because it ultimately depends on how heavy they are taken. So, and also how they're taken as well, right? Because some JAK inhibitors are creams, and also it could be arguable that you can take a JAK inhibitor at a lower dose and it could still be less of an immunosuppressant than cyclosporine. So ultimately, it relies on dose. But if we're just going to look at mechanism of action, you would probably say that the JAK inhibitor has the broad spectrum sort of reduction of the immune system, because they work by blocking the JAK-STAT pathway, which is like I guess you can say a central switchboard for many different inflammatory and immune signals, right? So you're cutting off like a lot of immune responses, and the strength of this would be very high in doing so. And the calcineurin inhibitor is primarily just focusing on stopping the T cells from waking up, right? So it's still pretty strong in terms of its mechanism of action, but you're not like suppressing every single thing in your immune system sort of framework. Whereas PDE4 inhibitors, these are very targeted modulators, right? So I would view them more so as a immunomodulatory agent rather than a straight up immunosuppressive agent, because they work by increasing a molecule called cyclic ANP inside of cells, which naturally dials down inflammation. So you have drugs like apremilast and roflumilast that I've talked about. But not to get too much of a geeky, vibe over here, because, I just wanted to mention that in case you guys were, curious. But let's return back to cyclosporine A, right? Now that we know how it works, what is it doing in hair for it to grow, right? That's a really good question. And there are some studies that we can look at to actually point at what it's doing to the dermal papilla. Now, when we look at a paper by Hawkshaw et al. Titled, quote, "Identifying Novel Strategies for Treating Human Hair Loss Disorders, Cyclosporine A Suppresses the Wnt Inhibitor SFRP1 in the Dermal Papilla of Human Scalp Hair Follicles," unquote, cyclosporine reduced the expression of a secreted frizzled-related protein, 1, in the dermal papilla of the human scalp follicles. Now, this matters because this specific protein serves as a brake on the Wnt beta-catenin signaling. So essentially, you're inhibiting something that would naturally block the Wnt pathway. And the Wnt pathway is important because in the I guess you can say, when it comes to the dermal papilla itself, the dermal papilla controls your hair follicle stem cells, and they regulate how your hair follicles grow, right? They tell the hair follicle stem cells when to proliferate, when they can differentiate into different types of cells that would ultimately create the follicle or regenerate the follicle, and the hair that comes out of the follicle itself, right? So if you have that pathway consistently on, you're possibly putting the hair follicle in this hyperanagen growth state. But otherwise, if you have this SFRP1 protein being secreted naturally at, random points, whenever it may be, it will stop that Wnt pathway from being on. It would turn it off essentially, right? So cyclosporine A is preventing the dermal papilla cells from expressing SFRP1. And by doing so, those cells continuously have their Wnt pathway turned on, and they keep excreting growth signals and telling the hair follicle stem cells to keep growing. So that's why cyclosporine A might be causing hypertrichosis effects and, or I guess you can say, in some of the studies we'll look at later on, localized hair growth effects. But still, it's not a good idea to chronically have this Wnt pathway on, right? Maybe for the hair follicles, it's one thing, but still there are risks, right? This is why people who take oral tacrolimus or oral cyclosporine, these calcineurin inhibitors, or even other sort of immunosuppressants, they cause for the SFRP1 protein to chronically be shut off. So by doing so, the Wnt pathway is chronically active, and that can lead to issues like cancers, right? Now, maybe less so for other immunomodulatory sort of drugs or immunosuppressant drugs, but it also depends at the dose you take those drugs at, because that will also kind of relate to its potency. So there could be a middle ground where you're not taking the drug at a high enough dose for it to ever cause such of a cancer concern, but still at the same time, it is something to be kind of mindful of. So to reiterate, you're getting that hair growth effect from cyclosporine A by suppressing SFRP1, a protein that would otherwise block the Wnt pathway. So by suppressing the SFRP1 protein, the Wnt pathway is on, and the dermal papilla, the cells that control your hair follicle stem cells, those dermal papilla cells can chronically keep sending out signals to, hey, keep growing hair, hey, keep growing hair. And ultimately, you get a very, very, I guess you can say, potent hair growth stimulant, should everything work the way it actually works, mechanistically speaking, or theorized mechanistically speaking. Now, Orient Bio probably looked at the literature, and they probably found this very old study from Israel from Galar et al. Titled, quote, Topical cyclosporine in male pattern alopecia, unquote, where 13 men with male pattern hair loss entered the study. Now, we did have a high drop-off rate because only 8 men completed the study, and it showed 2 of those men having significant regrowth, with 1 reaching cosmetically satisfactory improvement after 12 months. Now, the results were not dramatic across the board, but it was enough to keep the idea alive, because then you have this 1991 paper also by Galar et al. Titled, quote, Topical cyclosporine induces hair growth in human split skin grafted onto nude mice, unquote, which further supported a topical hair growth effect of in a human graft model. So once again, if you look at the 1994 review by Lutz et al. Titled, quote, Effects of cyclosporine A on hair, unquote, it put all of this into a broader context, that a dose-dependent hypertrichosis from oral cyclosporine had directly inspired these hair growth experiments. So the literature base is not this sort of perfect thing, and it is pretty small, but it does point at a real signal. And that signal is simply when you interact with cyclosporine, when that gets to the hair follicles, right? It stimulates them in such a way where they activate and start growing hair excessively. Another important thing to recognize is the other effects cyclosporine may have on hair itself. And people sometimes forget this, but you can see it in some case studies. And this is the effect on pigment. Cyclosporine is not only linked to more hair, but it has occasionally been linked to darker hair. According to Al-Rajabi et al., they had a case study where their 65-year-old patient developed hypertrichosis and a visible reversal from white hair to black hair after 3 months of cyclosporine therapy, with the change beginning at the scalp edges and then spreading more widely. The authors discuss a plausible biology for this, and they suggest that by altering inflammatory signaling and interleukin-2 related pathways, cyclosporine may help activate dormant melanocyte stem cells or recruit functional melanocyte stem cells from nearby hairs. They also cite a mouse study in which cyclosporine increased melanocyte progenitor cells in as many as 80% of hair bulbs and promoted repigmentation. So, it's not just that cyclosporine grows hair, it also could change the pigment of that hair and make it darker again. So this could possibly, if Orient Bio is able to prove this and it's able to be successful clinically, it could possibly serve as a repigmentation kind of therapy. Now, I want to move on to my personal experiences because I did use something similar to cyclosporine, but topically, and it was tacrolimus. I think I used it at 0.1 concentration. I talked about this years ago on the channel, and this was back when I was in university. I think it was around May 2023 or so. So 3 years now at the time of recording this video. It's April 12th, 2026. And I had to use it. This was after I quit my topical minoxidil use. I was having some scalp inflammatory issues and eczema and such. And I went to a doctor in Jersey City. And she told me, oh, we can just use tacrolimus, topical tacrolimus. Now, mind you, it was sunny during that time. It was blazing hot. And, essentially, I was concerned that if this thing had any sort of, UV sensitivity. She was like, no, there's no UV sensitivity. You'll be fine. You can put this on during the day. I was like, are you sure? And she's like, no, you're fine. So ultimately, I start putting it on my scalp. I put it on my scalp typically at night, but also, I do it in the morning when I'm about to go to work. So essentially, I noticed that after a week of use, I'm starting to feel more like heat on my scalp when I'm outside in the sun. Now, it's not just heat, but it's like I can feel more like air and wind touching my scalp, right? And my skin slowly became more sensitive. It started to flake. And then one day I just woke up and there were a ton of folliculitis pustules across the midsection of the scalp. It was really bad. And, I was like freaking out about this. So I went to go do some research on the internet and I found out that with UV interaction, that the tacrolimus itself can become genotoxic, right? So it can be very toxic to your cells. So I was like pretty pissed off about that. I quit using the tacrolimus. I used other sort of things to kind of slow down the inflammation and treat the folliculitis. And it was really bad. It was just really, really bad. That's why I want to caution people about just, going out there and getting topical cyclosporine or tacrolimus and putting it on your scalp and thinking it's going to be some kind of solution. Only do that if, one, you have a good doctor. Unfortunately, I didn't have a good doctor, but I think most doctors would warn their patients about just wearing this outside into the sun without any sort of scalp or skin protection. But also, I didn't get any sort of hair growth effects from the tacrolimus, right? And it's a calcineurin inhibitor. So it should have done what cyclosporine is claimed to do in those studies. Maybe if I used it now, I probably would have gotten that. But I also noticed some other things that I was experiencing. I had swollen lymph nodes and such. So that just didn't really give a good impression for me when it comes to topical tacrolimus use. So that's just my experience. So at the end of the day, I will caution against anybody taking one for sure. If you don't need it, don't find oral cyclosporine and use it. You're going to fuck up yourself. Don't do that. And two, even topical use don't even expect that you're going to get some kind of hypertrichosis effect, right? Because the doses we use them, cyclosporine and tacrolimus is very low that it probably wouldn't cause that hypertrichosis effect in most people. So it certainly wouldn't be worth just experimenting with it unless you have like another chronic issue, dermatological inflammatory issue that would need it. But other than that, that's pretty much it for this video. So OND-1 from Orient Bio seems very, very interesting. And it seems promising, especially with their slow release system using PLGA. Along with the intradermal injection, you can possibly get the hair growth benefits of cyclosporine or whatever sort of molecule they're coming up with that might be an analog of cyclosporine. To me, I think it's simply just cyclosporine in this PLGA sort of, copolymer that's slowly being released into the local tissue, mostly being deposited into the local tissue over time. And this could be a good hair growth stimulant. But, that remains to be seen. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching this video. I appreciate it and hope to see you in the next one. Sorry that it got a bit too long. I had to geek out and explain things. But anyway, use the timestamps to your convenience. And hey, you can go check out the Folligenz website. Right now, we have liposomal minoxidil sulfate as Folligenz. We're pushing it as a cosmetic. You can go check it out and maybe even try it out. Thanks for watching the video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Peace out.